like to thank the Foreign Policy Association for putting this lecture series on. I think it's a great event. This is going to be the best one you hear, I promise. And I also want to thank, the internet for allowing other people to join us today as well. So we're going to talk the new space era today. Okay, I know it's in the news quite a bit. You see things that are happening, but you really can't have time to break it down what's occurring in the space environment. So I want to give you guys just a little bit of insight into that and to see how the U.S. is handling some of the challenges and what we need to do going forward. But really the agenda today is we're going to get to this first, 45 minutes of Star Trek versus Star Wars. So this is going to be an in-depth discussion, back and forth, and we're going to figure it out today. Actually, that's happening down the hall. You can go down and see that one. I'm kidding. Sir, please don't leave. But the reason I show this is because I want to give you some insight into, hey, our cultural, our pop culture, a lot of times defines what our space culture is in the U.S., and it detracts from what's really going on in space. That's happened that way ever since we've had science fiction movies and things of that nature. So I'm going to lay out today what the new space era really is and how some of the things we used to think were impossible are becoming possible, as you're seeing today. I want to start off with a quick scenario. As you look at this picture, it may be kind of hard to see, but on the left-hand side of this slide, this was a 2014 launch by China. And this was a Long March rocket that launched a satellite. Basically, it was a precursor to their lunar landing where they brought back moon rocks. They launched this in 2014. On the right, you see in 2015, this is a SpaceX launch where it launched a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration satellite to a place in between the Earth and the Sun to basically gather climate and solar weather data. Now, the reason I show this to you is both rockets, when they have different stages, right? The long rocket gets the payload off Earth. That's most of the rocket, and then it jettisons that part. And then there's a final stage of a rocket that pushes it out further to where it's going, okay? Same with both rockets. Now, the difference between these two rockets is the Chinese rocket falls back to Earth, pretty much into the ocean, and SpaceX now lands their rockets reusable onto a drone ship in the Pacific Ocean, okay? The reason I tell you this is because if you were paying attention to the news today, a rocket hit the moon, hit the far side of the moon, if you have not seen that. Now, it is one of these two rockets. Most likely the Chinese rocket is what they said. 8 years ago that was launched, just hit the far side of the moon. Why do I show you this? There are things embedded in this scenario that we are facing today that really encapsulate what's going on in the new space era. Okay, A, there's a new competitor in town, which is China. B, there's a commercial sector, i.e. SpaceX, that is dominating the launch market, and innovation on technology to have reusable rockets land on drone ships. We have activity going on very far away from the Earth. That's not new, but you have basically these new actors doing this. The other part is we don't know exactly which one of these hit the moon, so it is very difficult to see what is happening far away from Earth, and you'll see why this has implications here later on in the lecture. And then the final one is there's space debris from some of these launches that are in orbit, chaotic orbits around the Earth. Okay, so all those factors put together, you will hopefully see as I go through this lecture why that is now characterizing our new space era. And so at 7:25 this morning, the final stage of most likely the Chinese rocket hit the far side of the moon, creating a huge crater. That has implications when we eventually go back to the moon. So we're going to talk about new space. What do we have to do first is we kind of got to take a quick trip back in history and talk about the first space age, or old space. Not to be confused with Old Spice, which is about 30 years older than the first space age, by the way. This is old space, or space classic, all right? What many of us are familiar with many people who grew up when the first space age began will be familiar with a lot of this. But I think it's good to set the context so you can see that contrast between what's happening now. The timeline I have at the top really indicates what the first space age was, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the pictures just kind of are a storyboard to help me walk through. So after World War II, The Soviets and the Americans, of course, were at the forefront trying to be the dominant New World Order leaders. A big part of that was the quest for nuclear capability. And I think that we all know that who lived through the Cold War, this was sort of the defining ultimate national security issue. And as the nuclear arms race was gearing up and moving, both sides were trying to figure out if we had to use weapons like this, how would we deliver them? And one of the most prominent ways it came forward was through an intercontinental ballistic missile. Okay, our countries are too far apart to do bombing. It made sense to do intercontinental ballistic missiles. Well, that same technology led to, hey, we have the technology to actually make it into space as well, and to finally do what people have always wanted to do is orbit the Earth, put something into Earth that orbits the Earth. So that's how it all sort of began. And so the U.S. and Soviets, we both had our scientists that we had gotten from Germany, quite frankly, who had begun developing this technology during World War II. And we went on our way, and we're kind of on this race, a competition to see who could be the first into space, whether for scientific reasons or for national security reasons. And as Mike mentioned at the beginning, in October of 1957, the Soviets did that exactly. They launched Sputnik, which is the picture you see there at the bottom left, which basically had a radio beacon on it, and it orbited the Earth. That's why we have what we call the Sputnik moment now. This was revolutionary. This was the first time we had sent something in orbit into space, and it scared the bejesus out of Americans. That's a military term, by the way, the bejesus out of us. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how you could use it, and quite frankly, everyone was on edge about what we thought about an object going over another country's, what we thought could be sovereign airspace. But at the end of the day, the U.S. said, you know what, I think we're okay with that because we were pursuing the same thing. And so the space race was born from that. We started our technology, we started our rockets, launching our satellites. Time went on, and then in 1961, a man named Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union became the first human being into space and orbited the Earth. Again, we came in second in that regard. It was a race. At this point, it was a full-blown competition to see who could advance their achievements in space now. And there was now ideology assigned to it. All right, communism is doing better than capitalism when it comes to space. And so we were taking a lot of notice of this and continuing to try. We were having quite a bit of failure at the beginning. The Soviets were doing a lot. They had the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first vehicle on the moon, all happening within the 60s, and we were playing catch-up in many ways as we went. Now, if you drop down to the middle, on the bottom, because now we were having these technological advancements in space, and you had the nuclear undertones, the two sides finally came to the table and said, we really have to get this under control, and they signed the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Which really set the ground rules of how space would occur in the Cold War. And really it came from what had just occurred. There was a non-nuclear proliferation treaty, or test ban treaty that was signed. And then they had just signed an Antarctica treaty because they didn't want Antarctica to become the next battleground. So they took all that and said, well, we should probably do the same in space. And it essentially meant we don't want to put any nuclear weapons in orbit. We don't want to claim sovereignty of the moon. We want to return astronauts when they land in your country. They are emissaries for mankind. And we want to treat other nations with due regard, which is an interesting way to phrase it, with due regard in space, which we're still trying to figure out today. And so those were the biggest articles. It was very general, but the two sides agreed on it. And this became our playbook going forward. And then, of course, the U.S. finally, with Kennedy's vision in 1961, we landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, thus really ending the initial space race that had started from 1945 all the way to 1969. At that point, the Soviets kind of backed off and just said, okay, we have really lost this round. We're gonna put our focus more onto some other areas of space that we're interested in. The U.S., of course, went to the moon a few more times, but also sort of backed up. And then we both kind of turned to this cooperative area of space, starting in 1975 with Apollo-Soyuz, where it's like, let's take two satellites from each country and let's couple them in space. And the technology to couple those two actually still exists today when we talk about what's happening on the International Space Station. But it all started with this cooperative effort, finally, between the two powerful nations. Now, the rest of the time in the Cold War, things were happening on Earth that, almost jeopardized our cooperation in space, but it really didn't. The Star Wars program by the Reagan administration really put a test to it. But for the most part, there was a cooperative element that happened in space. And of course, we had our space shuttle program, which was sort of the bread and butter closing out our Cold War, where this was now new technology where we could send astronauts to space and bring them home on the same spacecraft and land it like an airplane. And this became, of course, another symbol of our national power. Oh, wrong way. And so, this is what the old space, the classic space, looked like. Again, it was nation on nation. It was very expensive. It was hard to do. These were the most powerful nations doing a very tough scientific endeavor. Why we went to space was based on national security and for scientific interests. You had sort of this military, secretive, national security effort going on, and you had this NASA out on the front pages of the newspaper element going on. The commercial sector wasn't really even involved, except for building some of this for the government. That was the extent of what they did. People on Earth and us, we would go about our day-to-day lives and not really be influenced by what was happening, besides having a little bit of pride maybe for something that happened. Otherwise, it was all done within government bounds. Oh, sorry about that. And like I said, anything doing with the government is big, expensive, and slow. Bureaucratic. It takes a while to get a satellite built. It takes a while to launch it. There was maybe on a good year 60 satellites per year that would get launched. So it was just, this is how we operated. The treaties were sufficient for this era, as I mentioned, and it was a benign environment, meaning there were red lines in space. The Soviets and Americans, we kind of left each other alone in space when it came to military intervention with some of our objects in space. So at the bottom, you see, it was competitive, very hard, and then it became sort of competitive, cooperative towards the end. And that's where we left off at the end of this first space age. So, what caused the pivot to where we are today? And I'm going to cover a few areas that I think are significant that were seeds to get us to the era we are today. The first, Operation Desert Storm. Desert Storm, I'm sorry. So 1990-91, right? This was the first major war we'd been in since Vietnam, right? So you say, well, what does that have to do with space? I don't get it. If you remember, this was really the first time space became a headline in a conventional war. You start seeing things like GPS being introduced for soldiers and sailors and airmen to conduct this war. When you're going across a vast desert like we did in 100 hours, GPS comes in very handy when there are no markers to navigate. Missile warning, which generally used to be for intercontinental ballistic missiles, was now used by commanders in a specific conflict. Satellite communications was used for the commanders on the ground to talk to Washington. It was a specific effect that was being driven down to a conflict. We'd never really seen this before. Space was a critical enabler to this conflict. Even though it wasn't as robust as it is now, it put on display the possibilities that space could provide a military and a sweeping victory that we had. There's no doubt the rest of the world took notice. Russia, China, other countries looked and said, okay, this is a significant turning event for a military. Now, of course, our equipment and our soldiers and things that were on the ground were still an effective fighting force. This really allowed for that military power to succeed. The next one was later that year. What happened? The Soviet Union collapsed. Our prime competitor in space disintegrated, essentially. And then, of course, went through turmoil, as you probably well know, for a decade or more, trying to regroup from that. And so their space program did not go away. However, it really took a pause in many regards as they had other issues to deal with. And so we became the sole superpower in space, on Earth and in space. And so we had the freedom to do all those things I just said with new capabilities to support the way we fight and the way we live. And it just continued through the 90s. That was a huge event that pivoted us to where we are today. In 1992, as I mentioned, China in particular took notice of what was happening in space. In 1992, they set forth a vision to have their own human spaceflight program. They wanted to have their own taikonaut to go into space at some point. Because when you do that as a nation, when you put a human in space, that is when you know you've made it as a power. And you've done it by yourself, indigenously, with your own capability. And so they set forth on that, and in 2003, that's exactly what they did. They basically validated themselves as a space power, but it all started in 1992 as they saw what was happening in the world. And then finally, this may be a little tough to read, but essentially what these laws, these regulatory framework for put out by the United States, all centered on enhancing and bolstering a commercial sector in space. It started with the Reagan administration, said, hey, we need the commercial sector to come on board. Started off very slowly, and as each administration passed on to another, they all promoted this. And so the commercial sector started latching on to this burgeoning industry in space. I highlighted and I bolded a few that are significant. One of the first ones being in 1992, again, early 90s is when all this is happening. Kind of coincidental, I was graduating high school then, so maybe they knew it was coming. Land remote sensing policy. This is what spawned our commercial imagery boom that is happening. The next one is the Commercial Space Act, which focused on reusable rocket technology. And as I said from the beginning, Elon Musk has been the first to really harness that. And you see it goes on. And so we put our eggs into the commercial basket through legislation. And I'll show you in a minute why that has become, in my view, the most revolutionary thing that we've had. So, similar to the way we did the old space era, let's take a look at the new space era, because that's why we're here. We want to talk about some of the complexities. Okay, starting with 1991 up until now, basically. Same format. We've got the storyboard telling us where we are. Now, the way I like to describe this to people, because it's not as simple as the old space race of one-on-one, this I like to characterize into 5 C's, okay? Think of 5 C's, and I'll explain them here. The upper left, that is the International Space Station with the NASA symbol. That is our first C, which is cooperation. Cooperation that had started with the Soviet and American efforts in the Cold War, really amped up as we got into the 2000s, particularly with the International Space Station. I mean, this is a marvel of engineering when you think about it, that it was assembled, or the parts were assembled on Earth, or built on Earth, and it was assembled in space by different countries. Russia, the US, Japan, Canada are really the prime countries that got this moving in a collaborative fashion, and it has been the keystone to how we do our experiments in space, our scientific experiments. It's where our astronauts go regularly. It's giving us insight in how we're going to do further space exploration. And it's fascinating that a collaborative effort has happened. So we do have quite a bit of cooperation that is still happening in space. And with the increased amount of nations that have come on board, now we have allies that we've brought into this in more of a cooperative fashion too. Interesting to note when we talk about Russia-US cooperation, once the space shuttle program was shut down in 2011, we relied on Russia to get us to get our astronauts to the space station for 9 years before Elon Musk and SpaceX finally took over. So there was still that cooperative nature. So a lot of people like to think that space is all competition and war fighting now, or war fighting domain. There's a lot of cooperation that still happens. You see the cartoon Chinese taikonaut and the astronaut there. So this is the new competition that's developed. Now competition, again, has always been there. I call this kind of the reformulated competition. This is a new type of competition because not only do we have a new pacing competitor in China who's doing things a little different than Russia is or had, but you have other international countries that have joined the competition. There are 77 civil space agencies in existence today on this Earth. That is a lot of nations that have gotten into space. It has become more accessible. It's become more competitive. And for the reasons I told you that spawned kind of from the Gulf War, which is what we gain from space. And so we see this competition really playing out. And I'm going to talk a little bit more deeply about China in an upcoming slide. So Just wanted to kind of paint that picture. In the middle upper one, you see those rockets. Those are all different commercial rocket companies. Okay, you probably know the big ones, just SpaceX, Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company. These companies are dominating the launch industry. And this brings us to the third C, which is commercial. It's a commercial industry now. In my view, this is the biggest disruptor that there has been in the new space era. The commercial sector has grasped onto this. They have found ways to obviously make profit off of this, but to also lower the cost to get into space, lower the barriers of entry into space, be more innovative in what we're doing. Remember what I had said, we were big and bulky and slow and expensive. As nations were doing this, commercial companies have obviously a monetary interest in this, and they want to do things more economically and more innovative, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And it's not just launch. I mean, of course, you have tourism, you see that happening, but you have everything from rocket launch to data processing to new technologies that we haven't even seen before, which I'll talk here shortly, that are making their way into space, and it's all because of this commercial influx of commercial companies. Across the globe, there are 10,000 commercial space companies. 2021 alone, the space industry was worth, the global space industry was worth $471 billion, and it's on its way to $1 trillion by 2040 at the latest. Could be sooner than that. This is big business now, and it's got a lot of good things that can come from it. The fourth C, you see kind of that funny looking rocket explosion hitting that satellite. The fourth C is contested. Space is contested now. Russia, or the Soviet Union and the US, for the most part, did not mess with each other's satellites, aside from rhetoric or maybe the threat of doing something. We see nations now who are actively trying to degrade, deny, or disrupt our capabilities or others' capabilities as well. This is how they see them leveling the playing field. The US we're so advanced and we're so far ahead of many nations. This is a way they're trying to contest that space superiority. And this is new. This was not happening, like I said, in the old space era. So we have to find a way to maneuver around that, to handle it from a national security perspective. And it's one of the reasons why we have a United States Space Force now. And it's one of the reasons why we have United States Space Command in Colorado Springs. Okay, these are some of the answers to help mitigate some of these challenges that other countries are presenting. And in the very top right is our fifth C, which is congestion. This is a critical, very serious, possibly serious problem that is continuing to get worse if we don't do anything about it. So over the years, ever since Sputnik, the way we've launched, we just launched just to get things up in space. We didn't care how we did it. If it was done kind of sloppy as we jettisoned all the different things, rocket bodies and things, they would just stay there. So we have so many objects going around orbit right now that aren't active satellites. Upwards of 130 million pieces, 1 millimeter and bigger, that are orbiting in space, just because of all of the activity we've had since 1957, really. When you put an object in space, typically in orbit, it's going to stay there for decades. It's not like if you do something on Earth, you throw it up, it'll come right down. In orbit, it'll continue around, and that's what we're seeing. Also, what's contributing to that are some of these anti-satellite experiments or tests that some countries are conducting, where they are shooting missiles into orbit and destroying satellites to show their capability, creating 300 pieces of debris that will stay there forever and threaten other satellites, or stay there for decades at least, and threaten human activity up there. This is a very big problem that we must get a handle on because, again, this is something we've never seen before. So these 5C characterizations go into why we're trying to salvage what we have in space. But why does space even matter? I think I've kind of alluded to that. Okay? In the last 30 years, space has become vital to what we do. It becomes vital to our way of life, our way of war, the way we just go about our day-to-day business. Okay, it's vital to our navigation around town. It's vital to the way, people date nowadays online. It's vital to us keeping track of our pets because of the chips they have in them. Those type of things. Now, from a national perspective, it's vital to our economy, our financial sector, because Wall Street, if you didn't know, operates on a very specific timing signal that is given to it by GPS satellites. Our agriculture industry uses satellite technology to see when it's time to farm, if it's right time to farm, and when it's time to get the crops ready for harvesting. They basically set some of their equipment up on these automated systems that are tied to GPS that will go through and do it for them. We are living in a very modern society that is enabled by a lot of things in space. Your phone alone has connections to space that many people don't even realize. Not only the GPS, some of the camera technology comes from space technology. Some of the, if you've ever talked to customer service on your phone and you hear they're obviously in a different country, that is all being done on satellite communications. So what we don't realize is happening is really keeping our way of life moving. Now, our way of war is similar, okay? As I mentioned from the Gulf War, it gave us a distinct advantage. It gave us the lethality that we'd never seen. It gave us the ability to shrink the amount of forces we have and still get a victory the way we had done with huge armies before. Now we can be more lethal, smaller. We can extend our reach. We can fight these expeditionary fights with little to no concern. And it's mainly because, or a large part because of what we're using space for. And so we have developed a dependency on it. Almost to the point, probably to the point where we cannot lose that. And a lot of nations know that. They want to take us from an information age army to an industrial age army again. And so that's why they're threatening a lot of what we have. So if you remember sort of the summary I showed you from the first space age, what you see in yellow is sort of what's changed in the same areas. Again, now it's more international, multipolar. There are 16 nations with indigenous capability to be able to launch their own stuff, in other words. Build it and launch it. They're not reliant upon another country. When it used to be 2. Along with national security and scientific discovery, now there's economic reasons to be in space. Very big economic reasons. It's commercially led, not commercially absent now. The commercial sector is the #1 leader in space right now, innovation, technology. You will see organizations like Space Force and NASA, they were actively reaching out to the commercial sector for a lot of this technology and a lot of these ideas. We are connected now to space in everyday life when we used to not be. And it's more open, it's agile, it's transparent, it's accessible, it's cheaper. Cost of getting into space is lowering by the year, to include tourism, like you see on TV. The treaties we had were great for the Cold War, but now it is insufficient to what we have. It still applies. We still don't want nuclear weapons in space. And we still don't want people to claim sovereignty and that sort of thing. And we want to treat our astronauts, we want them to treat our astronauts okay. But the activity that's occurring now really needs to have some sort of regulatory framework, because it's getting to the point where some of the activity could hinder us from doing what we need to do in space. And so we really got to, and we'll talk this at the end of some of the challenges, but we really got to look at that, at the treaties, or at least some of the guidelines that we're using. And finally, it's a dangerous orbital environment now. It used to not be. It's dangerous because of other nations. It's dangerous because of the congestion. And that's continuing to exponentially go up. And you see there, it's competitive, contested, congested now, 3 of the 5 C's I mentioned. So I want to talk a little bit about China now. Okay, Russia used to be, or the Soviets used to be the prime competitor. Russia's still a very valid competitor, and don't get me wrong. They still have the institutional space knowledge from 60 years of what they've done. But China, by far, has taken it to a new level that we really should be concerned about. And so I want to kind of walk through a few areas and give you just examples of what I mean by their competition and where they are with us. Okay, the top one, it's hard to see, but that's the moon in the middle. And on the left side is kind of a picture of what's called the Artemis Accords. Okay, if you remember, we all remember the Apollo missions, right? Apollo was a trip to the moon, was getting people to the moon. Artemis in Greek mythology is Apollo's twin sister. This is the new U.S. policy, the new U.S. program to get us back to the moon. It's called Artemis. It is a bilateral program where they're signing up different countries that want to be a part of this. And right as of last week, I think with Romania signing, we have 16 nations that have signed on in the Artemis program. And what this is our new plan to get back and stay on the moon. What I mean by stay is start setting up infrastructure to where it's just not a trip there and back. We are actively staying and have activity on the moon. On the right side, China says, okay, well, we are going to go in with Russia. They've teamed up with Russia to do the International Lunar Research Station. And when you look at that, it looks a lot like our Artemis program, if you will, except they only have basically 2 participants where we have 16 now. So we're seeing this race back to the moon. We're going to see it in the next 10 years. It's just a matter of who we're going to have in our orbit, so to speak, and who they will have. And so that race is going to continue. China, by the way, because it's hard to go to the moon, of course, and it's hard to even stay there and have activity on the moon. So you have to figure out certain orbits around the moon, how to utilize gravitational forces by the moon, which we never really did during the Apollo era. China is figuring a lot of that out ahead of us, some of these special orbits. Now, NASA plans on doing that with its upcoming Artemis 1 and 2 missions, Artemis 1 later this year. But China's already around the moon doing activity. They're prospecting, okay? But why do we go back to the moon? We say, well, what we've discovered in the last 30 years or more is that there's actual resources on the moon that we can utilize to sustain activity on the moon and to potentially refuel for further missions out into the solar system. So it's not just this rock around the Earth anymore. There's actually value to it. And who else is jumping into this? Is commercial companies are saying, why does it have to be China or the U.S. governments that have to go? We want to get to the moon first. So whether you know it or not, there's another space race happening right now. And it's to the moon. Next, you see on the left side, you see the International Space Station. Okay? That has been the U.S., like I mentioned earlier, real pride for the U.S. and the allies that put that up. We have not let China participate in the International Space Station, mainly because we have legislation that's been put in every year that forbids China for us doing bilateral activity with China. So what did China say? Fine, we will build our own space station. So last year, they put the first 3 segments up, and it'll be finished this year. That's a picture of it. It's called the Tiangong Space Station. It's on the right there. And they are trying to get countries to join them in their space station efforts. Now, it's only about going to be a third of the size of the International Space Station, but the point is they have put a very complicated project together up in space. And so there's competition there. Let's talk about Mars. Okay, Mars has always been for the most elite. The U.S. has been the only country to really have the landers. I believe there's 3 rovers there now, and a helicopter, by the way. Last year, China put only the second country to put a rover successfully onto Mars, about a month after we put the Perseverance on Mars. And so there's a picture of it. Very similar technology to what we have. Imagine that. But they do have a rover, and they're planning on doing some sample returning missions from Mars as well. So to say that we are just kind of out there doing our own thing on Mars and not having much to worry about in terms of competition is no longer true. China is active on this. Let's talk about launches, okay? Again, the U.S. has always been the leader in launching. Russia's always been very good as well. And I think last year, the U.S. did very well, about 44 launches in a year. China had 52 last year. First time that they eclipsed the amount that we had. Now, we are putting up more payloads when we go up with things like Starlink satellites from Elon Musk. He's doing 60 satellites at a time every launch. China, I think the most they've had is 22 last week. But the point is, you see, they are slowly catching us in terms of launch capability. They are also going to the reusable rocket format, which is probably right around the corner for them. And that's actually good for everybody if they're reusing their rockets, so we don't make more pollution in space. But you can see the innovation of technology that they're catching us on. And launches are always the hardest thing about a space program. And they're doing it very well. The bottom one there is just kind of a picture on the left of our GPS network. The gold standard, right, for the world. GPS has always was the first navigation system up in space. We use it, like I said, on our phones. You can go to another country. If you ever travel to Europe or some of these other places, you can still get your GPS. It is a great system. China has something called the Baidu system, almost as equivalent to the GPS. Matter of fact, they have more satellites on orbit than we do. We are sending more that are more hardened against cyber attacks or jamming. However, in terms of numbers, they have quite a few satellites up. And by the way, they just signed an agreement with Russia, who has their GLONASS system, to work together and make these more interoperable. So if you have a nation like China, who presents a very clear alternative to countries who maybe want to have a navigation capability underlying their economic systems, China can use this as a diplomatic tool and say, if you come support what we're doing, Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, and we will provide you with some of our navigation satellites access. So you can see there's a lot of competition playing out with China. And by the way, what's added on this is China's one of these countries that's trying to develop ways to potentially disrupt what we're doing actively in space. Whether you call that weaponization or militarization, it's happening. They're one of the countries that launched oh, you're not supposed to see that. They're one of the countries that launched a anti-satellite missile back in 2007 that created 3,000 pieces of debris. And so it's very concerning. Russia, on the other hand, still very competitive. Their plan and program isn't as deliberate and as structured as China's. So that's why a lot of people feel China is presenting more of a long-term challenge. But the next thing I want to talk about and really go into is where we're going in the future of space. Because we kind of see where it looks now, and you're going to see the most important thing you've seen all day. And I don't want to, because this is something that, actually you're not supposed to see that. Hold on, that's flying saucers. Okay, okay, just forget what you saw on that. We can't show that. So this year we can have a little fun with that, right? So this here, it's hard to see. I'll explain. This will make sense here in a second. What you see on the left there is a picture of planet Earth. What you see on the right is the moon. And you see a bunch of lines in between. And you see orbits around. This kind of goes back to what I was talking to you about, the Artemis mission and the race to the moon. What we will see over the next 10 years, for sure, is more of activity leading out to the moon by commercial companies, by governments, to start setting up infrastructure. And what do I mean by infrastructure? In order to have presence on the moon, you have to have certain capabilities orbiting the moon. So you think of it as sort of like this waypoint where satellites can stop, connect, launch from there back to the moon and back. You have certain maybe communication satellites that are better equipped to communicate back to Earth. So there has to be infrastructure. They're calling this kind of like a superhighway to the moon. This is something that Jeff Bezos is really interested in. Makes sense. He has Amazon. That's his mindset. He's thinking, hey, let's take some of the same that apply to Amazon. Let's move it to space. And we've seen historical examples of this, right? I mean, the railroads, when they were built in the United States, that opened up a whole area of economic boom. When you had intercontinental railroads. You saw this with the spice trades, the British and the Western Europeans, when they would go around, they would set up infrastructure at the different ports, which obviously increased their ability to become an economic power. And you're seeing it with Belt and Road Initiative with China, right? As they go and they build infrastructure in other countries. It's kind of that negotiation. We'll help build your roads and we'll help build your infrastructure if you kind of come on our side and help us economically. Infrastructure works. Well, it's the same concept in space. Many people see the moon as the 8th continent. Okay, that's how accessible it's going to be. And so the country or the company that gets there first and can maybe mine some of these resources will benefit from that wealth. The upper left is something that's going to be happening near Earth. All right, we're still going to have operations and orbits and capabilities right around Earth. That's not going away, but it's going to change a little bit. You're still going to see this refinement of GPS and our navigation and our satellite imagery, our telecommunications for Earth, how to protect it. That's all going to happen. But the International Space Station is going to be decommissioned in 2030. And there's already plans to contract 3 commercial space stations around the Earth. One of them being Jeff Bezos's, 2 being 2 other companies. And by 2026, these will be potentially on orbit. These will be business parks in space that any company or any country or anybody that has the money wants to go into space and occupy a space station to do experiments can do that. It's no longer going to be astronauts solely. Some of our allies are concerned about this because there's obviously conflicts of interest there because this is now commercial companies. They would be supporting just one company. This could drive people over to the Chinese space station. So there's a dynamic coming there with the commercialization of space stations. The bottom left, there are a lot of companies that want to be the garbage trucks in space. They want to clean up space. That is a picture of a net, a depiction kind of capturing space objects that are defunct or not working anymore. There's a lot of companies interested in this, and there's a lot of technology trying to be put forth to handle our space debris problem. And I'm sure there are a lot of countries like the US and China that would pay money to have people kind of clean up that environment. And so you're seeing that technology. We'll see that continuously. The top middle is a Starlink satellite. If you haven't heard, Elon Musk has about 2,000 of these in orbit right now. And it's been only 2.5 years since he's done it. He's on his way to have about 40,000. That is what we call a mega constellation. And so you're going to see mega constellations like this because it's not only him. China has one they planned for about 12,000 satellites. OneWeb is another company with about 600 satellites. Jeff Bezos wants to put an equivalent to Elon Musk up with, thousands of satellites. This is the new way people are operating. They say, we're going to just put up these cheap little small satellites that if they don't work, we just burn them back into the atmosphere. Oh, well, that's fine. But we have it all networked, and you will get internet coverage anywhere on this globe. Or you get TV, or whatever the telecommunications satellite is. And that's what's happening because there could be money to be made. And think of the implications on Earth if everyone is connected. We're already connected pretty well with our cell phones, but there are still places on Earth that are not. This solves that. By the way, the military is even jumping on this as we have now the National Security Space Architecture coming on board, which is, I think, roughly 60 satellites of its own mega constellation, where it will provide resiliency for military communications. The bottom middle is a really interesting one. I think a very revolutionary way we're going to do business. In the old days when you launched a satellite, if it broke, it was just there. Now it's a piece of junk flying around or orbiting the Earth. What's happening or what's coming is, and the US has a program called the On-Orbit Servicing, Assembly, and Manufacturing Program, OSAM. Basically, on-orbit servicing. What does that mean, on-orbit servicing? Well, if you have a satellite that's not working for some reason, there'll be a company up there that can send a satellite to go inspect it to see what's wrong. They can refuel it potentially if it runs out of fuel. They can relocate it if it's fallen out of its orbit. Repair it even with another satellite. Assembly. Then you have assembly like we did with the space station. or assembly, instead of launching big bulky items into space, you launch little pieces, and then you have this object, the satellite that can assemble something in space. And then manufacturing, things like 3D printing. When that technology continues, you just launch basically the natural resources up, and then a robot or a satellite manufactures something on orbit. This is not science fiction. This is starting to come. In fact, for the on-orbit servicing part, we already have the U.S. has 2 satellites on orbit right now, called the Mission Extension Vehicle 1 and the Mission Extension Vehicle 2. They were launched in 2019 and 2020 by Northrop Grumman. And what those satellites did is they literally hooked onto another satellite, pulled it into orbit in one case, and now they've extended that satellite's life for 5 years. China has also done something similar in the past 3 months out in geostationary orbit. They've actually moved a satellite out of geostationary orbit that was dead. But when you think about that for a minute, something that can grab onto a satellite, if you're looking at it from a military lens, that can be a weapon as well. So this is very concerning activity. It's very good for sustainability, but it's very concerning. The bottom right, that's our space tourism. You will continue to see that, I think, just because. And some of these billionaires are going to continue to do it, but you will see it further out to the moon potentially. My wife and I always joke. We say to our 4-year-old son, you're probably going to live in a world where you can go to the moon like you go to Chicago. I mean, that's what it could be like. And then the top right is called the Gateway system. The Gateway is going to be a permanent structure orbiting the moon where when humans or even just unmanned spacecraft get out close to the moon, they dock with it. That'll be sort of this modular docking capability, so you can either go to the moon from there, go to an asteroid to do mining, go off to other parts of the solar system. That is going to be in place within the next 10 years is the plan. So a lot happening in the future. And the last slide and the last part of the discussion are some of the challenges before I end this discussion. First, the legal regime. So by the way, these challenges we have to overcome as a nation if we're going to move forward in any regard to keep up with China or stay ahead of China, I should say. Not keep up, but stay ahead of China and stay as the world's premier space power. We've got to fix a legal regime. The Outer Space Treaty was great, and there were some subsequent kind of amendments to it, but nothing drastic. We need to sit down and really define what behavior on space looks like. Because as I just kind of walked you through some of the capabilities that are out there, some of them get very, very concerning, particularly when we have some of our national level deterrent satellites, nuclear deterrent satellites in space still, along with a lot of our other satellites. So we've got to fix the legal regime. And it's underway. There's something called the Open-Ended Working Group that's meeting at the UN. It was sponsored by the UK, where we're trying to define what arms control in space really looks like. Russia delayed that, of course. Political priorities. This is always a problem with space, right? Like, why are we going way up there when we got problems down here? We're going to have to really work a way around this. And there's big problems on Earth for all countries. But if you see some of the long-term value of space, I think we need to really put this somewhere in the priority list to where we nurture a lot of what's happening. Now, the commercial sector is going to do what the market allows them to do. And so we may not be able to stop what's happening, but we need to at least have some political priorities that are allowing some of our space activity to happen. Cultural barriers. I showed you the picture of Star Wars, Star Trek, and we all kind of laugh. Cultural barriers like that, science fiction, kind of prevent our society knowing these important things that are happening in space, right? When shows come out that are comedic, and I watch them, they're funny, they really are, but they don't present what's really happening in space, and so our society as a democracy don't really understand the importance of space and how vital it is. So we've got to come over some of those cultural barriers as we move forward. Space, we have to sustain space. I think that is the number one thing we've really got to do, because if one object in space crashes into another, creates more debris, crashes into another, this is called the Kessler effect. It basically says that we will render a part of an orbit unusable. And we are in real danger of entering into the kind of that red zone of that happening. And that ruins it for everybody. Whether you're a powerful space nation or an emerging space nation, you've got to solve that first. And so we've got to get on this sustainability part. And I think the commercial sector is really taking the lead on this. And hopefully we're going to make some headway. We've got to get rid of our 20th century mindset. I think there's still some of that, hey, we just got to do things big and expensive, and that's not the way you're going to win in a new space era. I think the commercial sector, what they've latched onto is the best way, innovative, fast, new technologies, kind of taking what we've learned through maybe like the internet boom, the dot-com bubble, all the way up to now. Venture capitalism gets involved. We got to think more quickly, in more agile fashion, because I will tell you, China has put their course out to 2049 to be the #1 space nation on Earth. They've got a plan, and they're moving forward with it. Which brings me to our American vision. What is our American vision for space? If you read the space policy that was just issued in December, the framework for the policy, it's really a continuation of what the Trump administration did, which was a continuation of what the Obama administration did. It was kind of the continuation. Now there's some tweaks, but we're simply keeping a status quo and making the current system a little bit better, which is good. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But in 1961, President Kennedy had a vision. I think everybody understood what we were wanting to do. It's your guess as good as mine on kind of what the grand vision is for the United States in space. We need to really define that. We need to get our population behind it, our citizens behind it. Space is very secretive in many ways, and it's unseen. It's just kind of there, but it's not there. You know, you don't see satellites, and some of the most important ones we're not allowed to talk about. They're classified, at least in the military. There's a lot of calls from people within the military. The former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as he's retiring, said we've got to declassify a lot of these things. If we are going to deter China the way we need to from taking over as a space power, we've really got to show some of the capabilities we have. We do it in the other domains. People know we have aircraft carriers. People know what type of aircraft we have. These things work, right? When you see that stuff employed the right way. We haven't gotten there in space yet, so we've really got to get there to some degree. Not everything's going to be unclassified, of course, but some of the things we've really got to look at. And finally, we've got to get over the challenge of weaponization, which is occurring. Weaponization is happening, whether it's actively through anti-satellite missiles or sort of more quietly with some of these, like I said, hooking arms, grabbing satellites for different reasons. Countries are finding ways to weaponize space. Space used to be, everybody agreed it was really a place for peaceful purposes. It really is. That's even during the Cold War. War in space was not what we wanted. Weaponization is happening, and we've really got to figure out that challenge. And I think a lot of it comes through diplomatic channels, and a lot of it comes with some of the deterrence part I was talking about. So I hope this presented some pretty good thoughts for you. I hope you get a better understanding of, or at least an initial understanding of what's happening in space today and where it may be going. And I hope you can carry these conversations on with the people you know, because it's critical that we do this as a nation, because there's one competitor out there that is doing that. So thanks for your time. I look forward to the discussions that are to come at the end of this. So thank you very much.